When you think of Canada, what comes to mind? For a lot of people, it's a reputation as a global peacekeeper, a place that's polite, welcoming, and inclusive. But what if that's not the whole story? In this explainer, we're going to pull back the curtain on the parts of Canadian history that are often, well, deliberately left out, revealing a truth that is far more complex and, frankly, far more troubling.
So on the one hand, you have this image we all know, the true North strong and free. But on the other hand, there's a completely different reality. And it's one that Canada's own parliament gave a name to in 2022. That name? Genocide. Our goal here is to try and understand the gap between that comfortable image and this devastating historical truth.
And you have to understand, this isn't about digging up a few forgotten facts from the past. We're talking about a version of history that was actively and systematically suppressed. We're going to use the historical record to bring these buried parts of the Canadian story into the light.
So let's begin with a residential school system. Now, even if you've heard of it, the sheer scale and the raw details of this program are just deeply shocking. It wasn't a brief event. This system was in place for more than a century, and its impact is still echoing through generations today.
The scale is a number so large, it's hard to even wrap your head around it. Between 1831 and as recently as 1997, that's right, 1997, more than 150,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children were taken from their homes, forcibly removed from their families and their communities.
And this wasn't just a few isolated institutions. It was a massive, nationwide network. At its height, there were 139 of these schools operating all across the country. It was a system designed to make sure that pretty much no Indigenous community was left untouched.
The human cost was catastrophic. We know from official records that at least 4,100 children died while they were supposed to be in the care of these schools. Many of them died from things like malnutrition, disease, or abuse, and they were often buried in unmarked graves. Their families were frequently never even told what had happened to them.
This right here is maybe the most chilling part. The purpose of this system wasn't some hidden motive. It was stated, official policy. These are the words of the Canadian government itself. The objective was made crystal clear: cultural annihilation. The entire point was to sever these children from their language, their culture, their spirituality, and their families.
So let's be clear. This was not some tragic mistake or a series of isolated incidents. It was a state-sponsored machine. In 1920, the government actually changed the law, the Indian Act, to make attendance mandatory. If parents tried to hide their children or refused to send them, they could be fined or even thrown in jail. It was systematic and it was enforced by law. Now, as the last of the residential schools began to close down, you might think the story ends there. But it doesn't. The underlying goal of separating Indigenous children from their culture didn't just vanish. No, the policy simply evolved. It took on new names and new forms, but the goal remained pretty much the same.
This next phase became known as the 60 Scoop. It was done under the banner of child welfare. Social workers began a mass removal of Indigenous children from their families, claiming they were in need of protection. These children were then put into the provincial child welfare system and adopted out almost always to non-Indigenous middle-class families, not just in Canada, but all across the United States and even as far away as the UK.
Now, this timeline really puts things into perspective. Just look at the overlap. The residential school system is still very much in operation when the 60 Scoop kicks into high gear. And running right alongside both of those was another policy, one that was arguably even darker. You see, these weren't separate events. They were all interconnected pieces of a much longer strategy. In two provinces, Alberta and British Columbia, something called the Sexual Sterilization Act was law for over 4 decades. It only ended in 1972. So-called eugenics boards had the legal power to decide who they considered unfit to have children, and thousands of women, a shockingly disproportionate number of whom were Indigenous, were sterilized without their knowledge or any real consent. Sometimes they were pressured into it while they were literally in labor, or they were told the procedure was reversible when it wasn't.
So while the most long-lasting and systematic policies were aimed directly at Indigenous peoples, this pattern of state-sponsored exclusion, well, it wasn't just limited to them. We actually see this same pattern pop up in other parts of Canadian history too.
You know, Canada often likes to contrast itself with the Jim Crow segregation that happened in the United States. But the truth is, it's a lot more complicated. Racial segregation was perfectly legal in Canadian provinces like Ontario and Nova Scotia all the way up until the mid-1960s. And the country's very last racially segregated school, it didn't close its doors until 1983.
And then there's the heartbreaking story of the MS St. Louis. It's 1939, and the horrors in Nazi Germany are escalating. This ship arrives, carrying over 900 Jewish refugees desperate for asylum. They're turned away by Cuba, they're turned away by the United States. And then, their last hope, Canada, also slams the door shut. The ship was forced to return to Europe. 254 of its passengers were later murdered in the Holocaust.
And if you want to know the thinking behind that decision, you just have to look at this quote. When a top immigration official was asked how many Jewish refugees Canada would be willing to accept, his response was 4 simple words: none is too many. This wasn't just a bureaucratic decision. It was a policy deeply rooted in anti-Semitism.
All of this brings us to the really crucial question. What does any of this have to do with the Canada we see today? And the answer is everything. This history isn't just locked away in the past. It actually forms the very foundations of the modern Canadian state, and it explains so many of its ongoing challenges.
Right now, Canada is going through this incredibly difficult and painful process called reconciliation. You see the legacy of these policies in the widespread intergenerational trauma that still exists in Indigenous communities. And this story isn't unique to Canada. You see powerful parallels with Australia's stolen generations, and it really reveals the long, dark shadow that British imperial policies cast across its former colony.
So the single most important thing to take away from all this is that these events, the schools, the scoop, the discriminatory laws, these aren't just myths from a distant past. They're not anomalies. They are the very building blocks of the country as it exists today. Their legacy continues to shape everything from politics to society to national identity.
And so, we're left with a really fundamental question. When a nation's cherished idea of itself collides so violently with the facts of its own history, how does it move forward? How does a country reconcile who it believes it is with what it has actually done? That, right there, is the challenge at the very heart of Canada's story today.